here somewhere. Yeah. For like the first time, I'm going to have to go back and edit that because I couldn't find it on the sidebar. It was just gone, and it was right in front of me. My mouse was actually on it because it was set up for the recording and everything, and I just...
It happens. I mean, this is our not once, not twice, but thrice in the seat on this laborious Labor Day.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to just get like brain mush right now.
Oh yeah,
we've talked a great deal today, and what, that's 3 hours of recordings.
It is. Well, this will be our third one.
That was really good. And both of them have been great. And I'm not going to give away who all of our guests have been, but we've had some really, really good discussions today. And, we bounced around memorialization and thinking about Arnhem to, well, let's give away Marty. We talked to Marty for a little while because he's going to come up for sure.
I definitely think we've hit our own respective home runs on each guest.
Is it as if I planned this very well? I just like to say writer, editor, producer, wear a lot of hats. Yeah. I suck at a couple of them, but I'm pretty good at the booking of guests. It's that networking. Speaking of guests, we do have a guest for this show. It's not just going to be Bo and I sitting around talking. We are, in fact, joined by Dr. John McManus. So I promised that I would tell the story because I think it's funny. It's probably not funny, but to you, but whatever. I had just graduated from high school, and my dad and I went to hit the Beyond Band of Brothers tour in Europe. So we get to Holland, and there's this guy on the tour. He's just insufferable. And there's one person like this in every tour group where they have to say something and they have to be the one that go, well, actually, I think this. Yeah. And this guy, I mean, the entire time we were in Normandy, it was easy to just kind of be like, okay, so he's just saying Dick Winters and 10 guys won the war. I can live with that. That's fine. Let's just keep going. So then we finally get to Holland, and I'm thinking, okay, Band of Brothers wasn't so good when it came to Market Garden. Let's see what happens here. And he starts saying, he's like, well, if you're going to read one book on Market Garden, it's not that Buckingham book. That's too British. You want to read September Hope by and he couldn't remember the author's name. And I kept saying, I was like, I've heard of that book. I've seen it before. So I look it up. And of course, it's by John McManus. And I said, you mean September Hope by John McManus? No, it's some German guy who wrote about the Americans. He's now conflated It Never Rains in September, or Never Snows in September, with September Hope, and the two have become one.
I see.
And the entire time we were on tour, he kept going back and saying, you've got to read September Hope. That for a German, he knows everything about the Americans. And this went on for the next 2 days that we were in Holland. And then when we finally got to Germany, he just shut up for the rest of the tour. And finally, everyone on the bus could take a deep sigh of relief because he left early. He was one of the 8-dayers instead of the 11-dayers. And once he was gone, the tour got better. And I went home and I bought a copy of September Hope, written by John McManus,
the infamous
some German guy whose name I can't remember. And that was my first real exposure to John. But then listening to We Have Ways, he came on there several times, and then We Have Ways USA got launched. And then just 2 months ago, we were sitting in the English countryside together, and he and his wife were babysitting my child. So John and Kevin Hemel and I and Waitman Bjorn, we were the American contingent this year, and we had a great time and got to really get to pick John McManus's brain, which was incredible because, for some German guy who knew a lot about the Americans, John was pretty great. So welcome to the show, John McManus.
It's great to be with you guys. I just want to start today by saying Deutschland über alles. I'm glad you didn't have to deal with the guy for 11 days. I'm glad it ended at 8.
It was just the 8. He was gone. It was miserable. But great book, right? And it is very much, I think, the topic of our discussion for today is the book September Hope, an American point of view of Operation Market Garden. And this is we talked about this at the festival, or talked about it right before we started the show, is that for an Allied operation, the memory, the popular narrative is very British centric. I said this to Marty, I said this to Bo earlier. Even though A Bridge Too Far is a movie made with an American budget and American writing, the American scenes are just awful in terms of the acting, the depiction. It's just, they're the worst parts of the movie, because naturally you want to see what happens to the second parachute. You want to know what happens to John Frost. You don't care about Ryan O'Neal. And I fast forward through the James Caan scenes. I don't want that to be public knowledge, but those are my least favorite scenes in the entire movie. And there's something about the American piece of the story that it's either forgotten, or it's overlooked, or it's just overly simplified to the point where we could agree with the guy from the tour. It was Dick Winters and 10 guys that won the war, and they jumped into Holland. Everything went awry. They yelled at a British tanker for playing too much by the book, and then, war's over. What is it about this story that drew you to it, and how did you land that you had to write about the American efforts at Market Garden?
Yeah, I mean, so I had the same sort of impression that you had, in that it just seemed like the American story had gotten kind of forgotten or lost in the maw somehow. And ultimately, of course, the British 1st Airborne has the primary objective of getting over the Rhine. I mean, that's the purpose of this whole thing. And of course, 30 Corps and then, British 12th Corps and 8th Corps are the crux of it too. But from an airborne point of view, it's a majority American operation, with 2 U.S. divisions and 1 British division, and then a Polish parachute brigade, which is very under strength by American standards, that's going to be sent in there. And it just seemed to me, though I thought, Bridge Too Far, Cornelius Ryan's book, was absolutely brilliant. It just seemed to me there was more to learn about the U.S. side to it. And also not just the Market Garden experience, but also the more protracted experience of them basically fighting as frontline soldiers. These 2 U.S. airborne divisions used in a static defense capacity for the rest of the fall. And I felt very strongly that September Hope needed to have the scope to examine the ultimate consequences of Market Garden, which was the failure to clear out the Scheldt estuary and thus utilize Antwerp. And then we also have an American component to that, where the Timberwolves, the 104th Infantry Division, was part of that. That's actually the capstone chapter to the whole thing, and I see it as linked in the same story. So I never pretended that I was the ultimate authority on British airborne operations, or really could master the entire story the way I think Ryan did on some level. To the German side too. Oh, by the way, which It Never Snows in September is a terrific book, in my opinion. It's too bad
not to be confused with your book.
Exactly. Too bad the guy conflated it, but it's a fascinating book that I found very useful too. But that also was, I think, the brilliance of Ryan, that he was gathering firsthand material from many perspectives, including the Dutch too, which is obviously is part of this as well. And so, but I thought, as a U.S. centered historian, trained from that standpoint, I felt there was something I could contribute to really bring to life more than had ever happened. The U.S. experience, not just in Market Garden with 2 airborne divisions, but the consequence through the eyes of the 104th as well.
So, John, what was missing, in your opinion, specifically from the American perspective? What did you? I mean, because as historians, when we write things, we essentially want to, no puns intended, but to bring them to light. So what is that topic?
It seemed to me that, what we remembered, especially through the lens of A Bridge Too Far, was just some of the highlights of the American experience. The epic Val crossing, maybe the Nijmegen Bridge on some level, the Sun Bridge being blown up, the sort of carnival-like atmosphere in Eindhoven, when 30 Corps links up with the 101st Airborne and all that. And so to me, there was way more, because those two U.S. Airborne divisions are basically holding either flank on this Hell's Highway, as they came to call it. And really, that's what characterized their experience as much as anything. And not to mention, of course, the Groesbeck Heights, where the 82nd Airborne is massively overextended, given a mission that really is appropriate for two airborne divisions, to be honest with you. And would have been a challenge even then. And so I think that got completely lost in our historical memory, and all of that are contributory factors to what ultimately happens. Not just the Sun Bridge, but the difficulty holding Hell's Highway, the 502nd fighting for its life around Best. I mean, the 501st fighting at Erda, which is just a nightmare fight. The fighting along the Groesbeck Heights in places like Mook and Beck and Weiler and all these places near the Reichswald. And, to me, it was a very epic human story. And so I didn't necessarily pretend that someone reading that would have an ultimate grasp of the whole operation better than maybe what Ryan would have said or anybody else. But I did believe that there was a way to bring to life these American warriors, because that was what I had always had a passion for, is to try and convey that experience as accurately as possible, what that was like for these guys.
So you've got two American divisions, and the 101st and the 82nd. And just for you, I went and I dug around and I found my patches from the old days of living history, but there they are. But you've got the 101st, the Screaming Eagles, right? Made famous because of Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers, and then, of course, the series, right? So everybody can identify with them. Then there's the 82nd, who kind of has their own reputation in that they're not the 101st. They were in the war before them. They're the veterans. They're the ones who can tell the 101st what to do and how to do it right. And they get roped into this plan along with 1st British Airborne Division as part of Montgomery's offensive into Market Garden, area into Holland, and eventually into the Ruhr of Germany. And they're given, these outlandish objectives, at least for the 82nd, is to control essentially 25 miles of territory against what might be two SS divisions, Panzer divisions hanging out in the Reichswald, and not to mention the troops that are already in Nijmegen and in the surrounding area. And then there's the 101st, who's got to cover, 3 or 4 bridges?
At least 4, I think. I mean, it's, of course, Zun is the key one, obviously. But there's the Best Bridge. I mean, so the 101st also, though, has to hold that flank right at that kind of neck of this whole thing as 30 Corps coming through. So on the face of it, they have the easiest objective, but at the same time, they're dealing with some of the most powerful reinforcements attacking from either side that we didn't count on, like the 59th Infantry Division of the German army coming from the west, and then, of course, the whole mess coming out of the Reichswald, and then you've got some self-propelled guns and all this kind of stuff, too. I mean, so... these, I think everybody knew this during the planning phase, that this was going to be quite ambitious. And so one of the reasons why I called my book September Hope, and maybe the primary reason, is that I believe Market Garden was an operation predicated on hope. Basically hope that the Germans are pretty much done and that we can do this coup de main and that Germany is basically going to collapse. And this is these senior officers come from a generation in which they had lived in 1918 through a surprise collapse of Germany. And I think that they felt that history was something of repeating itself. The Germans, of course, had just absorbed horrible hammer blows on the Eastern Front with Operation Bagration, which is a disaster for the German army. They lose the better part of 2 armies or 2 army groups, whatever it is, but it's just massive. And of course, then Normandy, but also South France, which really is the knockout blow for the German presence in France on many levels. And so I think and then Hitler, the attempt on his life, I think there's a sense in the Allied High Command that maybe Germany's teetering on the brink. And so an operation predicated on hope, though, is not good ground to be on, in my view. And I just think Market Garden was always really a zero defect kind of operation. If anything goes wrong, everything goes wrong. Right. And also, here's the point I always make too. If we're talking about the big picture level, let's say everything goes right, exactly as you plan it. We capture all the bridges. We don't have the Sun Bridge blown up. We don't have the first Airborne cut off. We link up with the tanks, and then we get across the Rhine and go into North Germany. What then? Are the Germans just going to stand by while we put these armored columns towards Berlin? If we get to Berlin, is it just going to be a party there, or are we going to be in urban combat? Well, I think it's probably going to be the latter. So who's going to do that fighting? How's that going to happen? I mean, how are we going to supply that? How is that flank not going to be vulnerable? I mean, so there's just so many elements of this that don't make sense. And I fully admit, especially as an American, I'm an unrepentant advocate of the broad front advance in Germany. I think it ultimately worked, and I think it was the better go to maximize your advantages. And the problem for Market Garden, you're gambling on the single thrust in the hope that they're almost done, and in doing so, you basically protract the war because you're diverging from the second front and the second or the full front advance into Germany. And the reason you're doing that is you can't supply it because you don't have Antwerp, because you have diverted to Market Garden. So there's like a row of dominoes in this whole thing.
So what's the makeup of the two divisions as they go into Market Garden?
Yeah, so there's a mixture of veterans and new guys, as combat units tend to have. Both of them have been pretty well beat up in Normandy because, just like, I mean, not as bad as it's going to be in Holland, but also in Normandy, they had fought longer than they were designed for. Better part of about a month or so, a little bit more. And so they had been resting and refurbishing in England and drawing replacements and getting back up to strength and figuring out the next operation. And that's partially where the pressure on Eisenhower comes from, that you've invested a lot in these really quite excellent airborne formations. Why not use them? We have 18 airborne operations that are canceled, in that late summer, time frame, and they got to get into the game. I mean, that is certainly understandable, I guess. But so when they go in on September 17th, 1944, both these divisions are very powerful formations in the sense of their know-how, their combat troops, and the quality of these guys, the quality of their leaders, many of whom have been battle tested by now, especially the 82nd Airborne, which is just an incredible unit, in my opinion, at this stage. But, so on top of it, there's a diversity of sort of branches like there would be in any infantry division. So there's artillery components, there's signals, there's an anti-tank component, there's of course gliders and glider infantry, and we tend to forget that. We think of the paratroopers, but about a quarter of the combat strength are glider infantry. So these are really quite effective formations with a lot of different skill sets for the job at hand.
It's like one of those things too. I've seemingly found, I learn something new every day. And when it comes to Market Garden, there's a couple of things that we've kind of discussed with some previous guests, because we're kind of doing this whole Market Garden week, so to speak. And shout out to Joey. Joey's done an excellent job of getting some pretty heavy hitting guests. And a couple things that we've discussed is sort of the success rate of Market Garden, whether it be 90% successful, and the varying percentages therein. And sort of one of the things that historians really like to do is play what if. Is you sort of mentioned, had everything gone right, there's all kinds of logistics that we got to think about, sort of the post era of Market Garden. Is the war over by Christmas of 1944? I don't know. And that's kind of, I guess, my question here to you is, do you agree with that 90% success rate? And if not,
let's see where John puts the percentage.
Yeah, I'm really analytical on that.
Well, I just love that whole phrase. It comes from Montgomery's memoirs, of course, or his assessment of Market Garden is 90% successful. And over the years, I've been a bit flippant about it, because to me, it's so nonsensical. the whole purpose of Market Garden is to get across the Rhine, collapse their front, and somehow end this war in 1944, right? I mean, that's what we're doing there. Did we do that? Obviously, we didn't. So what I compare it to is trying to say you're 90% successful in this context is like saying you're sort of pregnant. Either you are or you're not. It is one of those either or things in life. And I'm sorry, it's just one. So to me, to say it's 90% successful for what it's designed for, just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, we could break it down a little bit and say, well, we liberated a portion of Holland. From the Dutch point of view of those who were there and lived in it, that's a success. And so I totally.
That's the point that Joe Hook made, was that, if you were living south of Arnhem, and you lived in Nijmegen and further south,
it had 100% success rate.
It was 100% successful for you because you're free of Nazi tyranny. You're no longer on the front row.
At a hell of a price, too, in that your homes have become battlegrounds now, too, for the most part. And probably a lot of your folks are involved in the fight, too, not just passively there. I mean, the Dutch underground is a big part of this whole thing. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely respect that perspective. But I think if we're really talking about the strategic purpose of the operation, to me, the word success just can't be used on any level. If we're thinking about it from, which I tend to do, from the point of view of the U.S. Airborne Division, so the troopers who fight there, no, I mean, it's a complete fiasco, really. Why did we lose? Why did my buddies die there? Why were my buddies wounded there? Why was I there all fall, if I'm lucky, and somehow get out without becoming a casualty for this larger purpose of breaching the Rhine and ending the war, which clearly did not happen. So we could point to a lot of small unit fights where we get the better of it, and certainly we inflict some damage on the Germans. But I see Market Garden, I guess, maybe from a irredeemably American point of view, as really just a fiasco and nothing on the realm of success.
Were there any hesitations by Maxwell Taylor or Jim Gavin looking at the plan? I mean, I know there's the line that Gavin, he can't be serious, right? And that's to Norton, I think.
So Jack right? Norton, yeah. So Jack Norton was his operations officer, very young guy at this point, and he's a lieutenant colonel, and here he is, the ops officer for an airborne division. It's incredible. He will, of course, retire one day as either a 2 or 3 star general. But so I think Gavin, especially from the start, really doesn't like Market Garden. He doesn't like the concept of what they're doing. He thinks it's too ambitious. He thinks the British, as he viewed it, certainly Browning, he thinks is too breezy about the possibility of opposition and all the problems you might encounter. And there's the tension, of course, with the Army Air Forces, over how many missions they can fly on the day of the drop, and how we can get our gliders in and the resupply and all that point of tension. But I think Gavin is really discomfited from the beginning about this overstretching of his division, all these different objectives. The 82nd Airborne has 10 different bridges to take. Not just the 2 famous ones at Nijmegen, the railroad and the road bridge. You've got all these other little bridges over smaller rivers that are leading to Nijmegen. And then, of course, you got the Grave Bridge. And that's one of the things that is successful about Market Garden. We get the Grave Bridge pretty quickly over some pretty amazing fighting. But Gavin, I think, grasped pretty quickly that his division was bound to be overextended. Taylor, I think, is quick to understand, especially once they're on the ground, not as much beforehand, but once they're on the ground, he's quick to understand the problem of the flanks and how difficult it's going to be to hang on to what we would now call a main supply route, which is Hell's Highway. And that is just a narrow road. And so that's what your control is, this corridor. And I think Taylor is very quick to grasp the challenge of that. He doesn't have to deal with the overextension initially, at least, quite as much as Gavin does. But I think it's fair to say that at their level, and certainly at the lower level of battalions and whatnot, there's a lot of trepidation about this. I should mention too, at the 18th Airborne Corps level of General Ridgway. General Ridgway doesn't
what's Ridgway thinking in all this? Because he seemingly he's left out of the picture, right? Because you've got Brereton. And then all of a sudden it skips over Ridgway and goes straight to Browning.
Yep. Again, the Britishization of the operation, which, okay, great. I mean, I totally get that, I guess, but I don't necessarily means that we should empower Browning in this way. I don't think that call really worked out. Whoever really comes up with it is still a little opaque, but certainly Montgomery, Brereton, those folks have some say. Ridgway, his take on all this, he just hates this whole thing from the start. Imagine this. If you are the most successful airborne commander in European theater, you could argue, and you've been promoted because of it, you are now in command of the largest tactical airborne formation the Allies have. And here comes the biggest drop of the war to this point. And, oh, by the way, you're not going to command it. How would you feel about that? It's like as if you took the Beatles after their massive success and said, no, I'm sorry, we're going to backbench you for this new band. Once we have this big concert coming up, you're really not part of this somehow.
So anyways, here's Wings.
Yeah, and not even, maybe not even Wings, here's, name an obscure band, whatever. Here they are. Let's throw them into the mix. And so, yeah, if Ridgway is Lennon and McCartney, he's not going to like this a whole lot. I don't blame him. I think if Market Garden had any chance of success, I think it would have been with Ridgway in command. But so what does he do? Well, he's an opponent of the plan, but he really doesn't have much influence. And he will eventually, he's not going to parachute in, but he'll drive in to the corridor and spend several frustrating days kind of careening around, just really spitting fire about what he thinks of as the slowness of the operations and a lack of momentum and command urgency. Market Garden for him is just such a frustrating moment in the war. And he's careful not to rip Browning, because he respects him, but he just doesn't think this is managed the right way.
So clearly mistakes were made. We have the ability of hindsight. But even almost 80 years later, historians, debate both the effectiveness of Market Garden, but also a more important question, John, who's to blame?
Well, as I said, September Hope, I think ultimately Eisenhower is to blame. And Eisenhower, I always hasten to add, Eisenhower is an amazing commander. He's arguably the one person you couldn't possibly replace on many levels, but he's a human being too, and human beings make bad decisions and bad calls. And in this case, he has ultimate responsibility. Why? Because he gives Montgomery the go-ahead. Now, yes, it's true. It's Montgomery's concept. And by the way, kudos to Montgomery for coming up with something this aggressive. He often gets criticized for being cautious. And by the way, I understand why he's cautious. He doesn't have a lot of manpower. Britain's near its end. He's very, very Montgomery cares a lot about his soldiers and about, the future of Britain and Canada and all the, these countries of how you're going to build the future around them. And he's really thinking along those lines. He understands a lot about combat. He's been in a lot of combat. So I think it's to his credit that he at least comes up with something aggressive. It's just, I feel, wrongheaded, just in my opinion. So when he comes to Ike with this plan, I just think Eisenhower is amazingly slow to realize if you give the go-ahead to Market Garden, you're essentially taking your eye off that broad front ball. That was, of course, Eisenhower's concept. And by the way, guys, he's very influenced by Grant and how Grant fought the Civil War. And I think to the good, he's influenced in that respect. And so you're basically you're getting rid of the Grant concept of saying broad front, overwhelm them with all our strengths, and you're going after the sort of McClellan-esque kind of
capture Richmond,
and everything will be hunky-dory then. And I think he doesn't understand when he gives Monty the go-ahead that's what this is going to mean. He thinks he's going to just get a bridgehead over the Rhine and maybe develop it at his leisure. He doesn't understand that the supply situation is such that when you pick the Market Garden operation, you are, robbing that Peter to pay Paul kind of thing. And then he has to kind of confront the sort of reality of his choices. So not only is that bad, but several days later, once the operation has clearly failed, First Airborne more or less annihilated, and you're not across the Rhine and all that, he really doubles down on it even more. And I just, so to me, this is his worst moment. And he's maybe even a little bit bullied into it by Montgomery, whose behavior was really just atrocious in their meeting on September 10th, 1944, aboard his plane.
Monty, I'm your boss. You can't talk to me that way.
Exactly. And credit to him for doing that. But I think he's too heavily influenced because his initial reaction is, Monty, you're nuts. I mean, how are you going to reinforce and resupply this column if you get across and all that? I don't understand.
So is he stuck playing a game of politics?
Maybe he is. He's trying to keep harmony in the Allied command, and there's much to say for that, and it's worked for him well, and it will again. But I think, I do think maybe there's some politics in that sense of trying to, and I don't mean like, electoral politics as we think of it. I mean more like keeping harmony among his senior guys, and keeping everybody on the same page. But in trying to please Monty, obviously he's going to anger Bradley and Patton famously, and it might not to mention, what's going on with 6th Army Group too, and all that. So, because they're not going to be happy about, the priority for 21st Army Group, and you can understand. So, I do think he's doing that, and this is one time where it doesn't really serve him very well. He really had to keep his eye on the Antwerp ball in that sense of saying, you know what, we've got an amazing get here that we thanks to the British, we get Antwerp and its dock facilities intact on September 4th. That hardly ever happened in World War II. I mean, that was huge, and I don't think they really quite grasp how important that was. That I've studied a lot about the logistics of the campaign in Northern Europe at that point, and it seems to me that if you have Antwerp, Marseille, Toulon, you are probably 80 to 90% of the way towards supplying and sustaining your armies, provided you can keep a road net and develop that, which the Allies were getting good at that. So to me, Market Garden is so tragic in that vein. Could the war have ever ended by Christmas of 44? I think that's questionable. Who knows? But we'll never know. But I also don't think, and this is the other thing I've never understood, and we see the same mindset later in Korea, of somehow the enemy is going to be on our same clock of, okay, let's end the war by Christmas, and then somehow we'll all go home. Really? Aren't we going to have to occupy Germany? And
what about occupation?
Aren't we going to have to do that in Korea too if we win? Even, I mean, so to me, it's a chimera.
It's such a morale thing, I mean, they said the same thing in the Great War. We'll be home by Christmas, and they were right. They were home by Christmas 4 years later,
right? 1923, or 22.
Yeah. Right.
So we get D-Day, September 17th. Drop goes on. There's a little bit of resistance in terms of flak batteries and everything, but generally speaking, the landings are, compared to Normandy, really successful, and everybody's dropped in at least the rough vicinity of where they should be. Then everything starts to come apart. 30 Corps starts moving. 101st Airborne. What's going on with Taylor and the 101st Airborne?
So Taylor and the 101st Airborne, of course, part of the division is the 506, especially, is moving actually southward to link up with 30 Corps coming from the Belgian border. And that's, of course, when they had this famous engagement where they're fighting against fixed position 88 millimeter guns. These are actually real 88s, not just the typical veteran. 88 is everything, that whole thing. They're real 88s, and it's a tough fight. And they're just about to get the bridge, and it's blown up in their faces, of course. And then that's going to dictate everything that happens in that area of operations. Infantry can move across the Wilhelmina Canal uncomfortably, but they could do it, and especially like on plank boards and whatnot. But vehicles, that's another matter, and we got to get vehicles, right? So now it's an engineering problem to fix that bridge, get it repaired so that 30 Corps vehicles can move there. 30 Corps is not moving as fast as we want, because who could have guessed this? They're encountering stronger anti-tank opposition than we expected. All right. So right there is a little bit of a bug in your ear of, the Germans aren't just folding the tent. They're going to fight. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the flank fights that the 502nd and 501st are dealing with more so than the 506 at this point. And then, they're going to be, the 101st is going to be lucky that they're going to be able to get the 327th on the ground, within whatever it is, the first day or two. So most of the division will be deployed, but they're really going to have to figure out the Sun Bridge situation first. And then one of the things I don't like about the movie is they portray Taylor, and the aftermath of the opening of the Sun Bridge and all that. And then they portray it as, Taylor, we're going to hand you off now to the 82nd Airborne Division, and whatever he says, hold on to your wallets or something. And that part is funny, but it makes it seem like the 101st doesn't have anything more to do. Now it's over for them.
Yeah. They've successfully rebuilt a bridge. Now it's over.
It's all over. No problem. And I understand why a filmmaker, I guess, has to do that, but it creates a terrible impression. And I think maybe they tried to recover that in, Joe, in your favorite scenes with James Caan. It really is, but it really is a dramatic story of what happens there with, with Legrand, what's his name? Johnson, I think, legs, and this all, did happen, but it doesn't somehow fit everything else. It's just this random event.
It seems like it's an afterthought that gets thrown into the movie.
It kind of is because they've got James Caan, I guess, so they have to use him. And
what do we do with the Godfather?
Right, exactly. So interesting little backstory. So what was the guy's name? Eddie. I don't remember. James Caan plays a guy named Eddie something, but so that veteran had written about this experience with his captain, and Legrand Johnson they had his wife had written to Ryan and all this, so he was in touch with them. So Eddie, apparently, after telling this whole story to Ryan, tried to backpedal from it and say, "Oh, wait, that never happened." And Ryan later wrote and said that he wanted to just cold cock him right on the right there, because he was so angry that either the guy had lied to him or that he was trying to backpedal from him, but they couldn't get away from that story. I mean, the scenes have been shot, and so it probably happened, but who knows? But it's one thing I don't like about the movie. It makes it seem like the 101st doesn't do anything anymore. So Band of Brothers helps us recover that somewhat through the lens of this one company. I think there's some really good scenes there where you're seeing just how in crisis the corridor is, of trying to hold it open at that point. And then, of course, the 101st is just going to have to fight like any other American formation to hang on either side. And that's a really tough go, even though supply is not as big an issue for them as it will be for the 82nd in the early days.
And their battle at Eindhoven is worth reading about and looking into, because it is an intense struggle. But in the popular picture, it's all right. 30 Corps moved past the 101st. Now let's talk about what happens with the 82nd.
Yeah,
what goes on with Gavin and the 82nd, because they get there and all of a sudden now, to use the phrase, the shit hits the fan and problems start to mount very, very quickly.
Big time. Yeah, I mean, almost from the beginning. But I'd say from an 82nd point of view, the only thing that really goes right from the beginning is the Grave Bridge, which Jocko Thompson and his guys take, very early on. But it's a pincers operation, right? You got coming from south and north on either side of the river, because they know about the importance of the objective. And so I think that's very well planned, but it costs you a lot of combat power pretty far south in your area of operations. You've got then, bridges 7, 8, 9, 10. And I think the Germans blow up or heavily damage all but one of them. And so, you're basically funneling, what remains of your power through that one bridge. I think it's bridge 10, but sometimes the number is getting a little, but the bottom line is there's that one bridge. And then once you do link up with 30 Corps on, September 19th and later, you're going to have to be funneling through there. In the meantime, as we've always worded from the beginning, German reinforcements coming out of the Reichswald are now a problem. So really, it's for the 82nd Airborne Division, it's the eastern flank that's the issue. Those heights, the Grossbeck Heights, which by the standards of, if you happen to live in a mountainous area or anywhere with a lot of hills, you would look at this and laugh, but because it's not very high. But this is Holland, remember? So it's all low ground, and so any ridge line is pretty decisive ground, and the Groesbeck heights are not high, but they're high enough that obviously that can compromise the entire area of operations. Down by Nijmegen and the road net and all that. So the 82nd Airborne is not dealing with as much German reaction from the west, but there's enough coming from the east. So they have this dramatic situation where they've got a glider resupply coming in and reinforcement coming in, and they don't hold the landing zone. So paratroopers have to basically carry out a frontal attack to go and take that landing zone. And it's, this is all done under Gavin's supervision to some extent too. It's so already you're seeing a crisis fight. The other thing that's happened to them is that the weather in England is not very good, fog and all that. So it's not until September 23rd that the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, which is the glider element to the 82nd, that they can get in. And that really impacts things for Gavin a lot, because if his division was overstretched, you can imagine, if he's missing a quarter of his complement, that's not going to help his situation at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, John, it seems that the 82nd Airborne and Jumpin' Jim seemingly get a pretty bad rap for Market Garden, and there's several historians who may point the finger at them, and they're the cause of failure. So, what is it that you found that would sort of refute that?
Yeah, to me, I'm actually a little bit, I won't say stunned, but it's surprised at the level of criticism that Gavin has gotten in more recent times for that. Especially to me, when you look at the larger defects of Market Garden, to zero in on a guy who has a lightly armed airborne division with a 25 whatever mile front, holding this high ground and capturing these major bridges, 10 bridges and all this. Oh my gosh, how did you completely screw up all of Market Garden? It just seems to me to be a bit, a bit.
You destroyed Monty's plans, and it's all your fault.
Exactly. It's like, come on now. Let's look at the Monty level. There's where the problems are on a lot of levels, not quite the implementation here. So the nut of this tends to be, why didn't they either push for the Nijmegen Road Bridge as early as possible, and or why didn't have drop zones on the north side of the Vaal River to move for that bridge? Okay, so let me break that down. Gavin basically stood with his regimental commander, 508th Parachute Infantry, Roy Lindquist, and he told him, chapter and verse, he said, okay, the road bridge is extremely important. You must take it. Now, Norton was there as a witness, by the way. He jotted the notes. It's not just him later covering for his commander. There's the notes. I've seen them. And so Lindquist is told very specifically, very urgently, you must get that bridge and don't get involved in the urban maw in Nijmegen. Go along the riverfront where you're going to have a smoother go. Okay, so Lindquist diverges from that because he thinks he's got good intel from a Dutch resistance guy who possibly was a collaborator. And so predictably, the 508th gets bogged down, in the urban maw. Okay, but let's just imagine they don't, and you do get troops to that bridge. It's still hard for me to imagine how they're not going to get, as I often say, frosted. In other words, you remember what happens to Johnny Frost and his guys?
Completely isolated.
Yeah, remember what happens to Johnny Frost and his guys? Yeah. How is that not going to happen to one battalion from the 82nd Airborne that's going to be taking the wrong end of some SS units that are going to want that bridge back, aren't they? No matter which side of the river we're on, I think there's going to be some level of German reaction. So to say that we're going to be in a position to use that bridge earlier seems to me very questionable, because we lose our 36 hours anyway because of what's happening at Zun. And no matter what we do with the Nijmegen Bridge, it doesn't matter, doesn't it? So by the time we're linking up with the British tankers, we've lost that time. And it's given the Germans enough time to react, as they do with that scratch force. What is it? Kampfgruppe Hankey. And so he's got all these different disparate forces, including elements of 10th SS Panzer that are now going to come into play. How are they not going to be there anyway? It's just, So, and it's true that the Grossbeck Heights are a major objective, and you've got to control them. Okay, if the Germans have that and they can place artillery up there and all that, yeah, whether the bridge is useful, I mean, that's very questionable there too. And I totally understand the argument. The high ground's always going to be there. You get it when you get it. And I think that makes good sense. But you also have to look at it in the context of these disparate objectives you've got here stretched so thin, and that ultimately, apparently, the bridge is what matters most. If it does, we're probably going to have to make the choice of, okay, we don't hold the heights, but we have the bridge here, and we're just going to have to try and move people and stuff across as we're eating artillery shells at a massive level from these guys. How is that going to be a really concerted, aggressive, successful push for the ultimate strategic purpose of Market Garden? Very hard for me to see that, I guess.
So first thing, I'm glad that your involvement in telling the story has gotten some voices out there. We're not going to point fingers. We're not going to name names, but it's gotten certain individuals to back away of their criticisms on Gavin. And just by saying, oh yeah, John, that's a good point. That's a good place to start. But where does it, because it's not so evident in, say, Ryan, and it's not so evident in Buckingham, because he's really looking more at the British airborne perspective. Where does let's just call it what it is, where does the hate, the criticism for Gavin start at? And how does it kind of morph? Because, memory's the thing here, right? How does Gavin go from, his very able division commander, Jumpin' Jim Gavin, best combat experience, all these things, to, he was great, except at Nijmegen Bridge, where he's a total failure, and the entire operation and Bernard Law Montgomery's reputation is destroyed because of him.
Yeah, it's all his fault. Yeah, exactly.
I threw the same line at Marty. He's everyone's favorite scapegoat. Does the name apply? And then how does he get that reputation?
I mean, I don't think the name I think it's like blaming a fire chief for a massive building fire that another person has set. You didn't put out the fire well enough. Oh, okay. I mean, to me, it's not really fair, but that's only my opinion. But where I think the germ of it comes from is Julian Cook, the commander of 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry, who has to, get the wrong end of that Vol crossing. And he says, and kudos to him in a way, but he stands up to his division commander. Well, General, if you wanted to capture the north side of the bridge, why didn't you drop people on that side? And it's a fair question. And not like Gavin hadn't considered this. Of course he had. But he felt it would be too dangerous and too problematic. And you don't necessarily want guys dropping near built-up areas, I think, for obvious reasons. So
how would Air Transport Command have received that?
Air Transport Command would not have liked that, because there's likely to be flak batteries there too in these areas and near bridges too, right? So, and then obviously the British encounter something of the same tension. So to say that would have been a good option, I think, is again sort of problematic. And so I think maybe the initial critique starts with Julian Cook, but I think it's more like recently in our kind of podcast era and commentary era, which has been so much fun. But I think that's just maybe a new take to have on it, to zero in on this aspect of it. Because I think in the West, among us Anglo-Americans, there's always this hope to somehow salvage Market Garden and say, if only this, then that. And I think initially the focus was, especially for Americans, I think quite unfairly, the focus was, well, Cook and his guys, they took the bridges, and then those damn British tankers had no aggressiveness, and they sat there and brewed tea, and that whole thing. If only. And so I think Gavin becomes sort of the fashionable guy to beat up over this, over the Nijmegen Bridge. But I think that the point of view doesn't really take into account the realities of what he's dealing with. To me, the best example is September 20th, how he has to spend his time when you have this big Vol crossing. It's got to be the focus, of course, for his whole division. He's actually called away. He doesn't actually see it. He wanted to witness it and actually maybe eventually lead it himself on some level, but he's called away because of a crisis at the Grossbeck Heights. So in this sort of Candyland world where we can get the bridge early and everything is going to go right, doesn't that kind of unravel that argument on some levels that, at least as I see it, I don't know. It's a fun debate, I guess, but if they're putting that pressure on you from the Groesbeck Heights, there is a problem there that you have to deal with. And so it's sort of like you've got objective 1 and 1A, I guess, and not enough really, not enough strength really to deal with it as you might hope, I guess.
And Gavin's got to use the resources that he has, which thankfully, unlike Taylor, he brought artillery with him. So he's able to at least hold certain pockets with just masking it with guns. And that's helpful. But then, too, we can even see the strain on 30 Corps. Yeah, they've got to cover a great distance in 2 days. They've got to go 64 miles up a single lane and all these things, right? But even when they get to Gavin's sector, they're deploying some tanks to essentially fire as static artillery pieces towards Nijmegen. And then they've got other tanks that have to support the infantry moving through the town, and other tanks that have to help Gavin support the defense at Groesbeck. So there really is, it's the concentration, it's the problem, but there's a lot of blame that can be passed around for Nijmegen specifically, but they get beyond that then. And then the tanks stop and everybody has tea, which we talked about with a later episode that'll come out after this one, is that, well, first off, that's not what happened, and that's not why they stopped, although it is a good thing to do when you stop, because there's not much else you can really do. But the argument that's put forward, because we've all spent enough time today talking about this and then looking at it over the last, however many years, there's the argument, well, the 82nd could have just fought with the armor up Hell's Highway to Arnhem. With what men?
And who? Yeah. 3rd Battalion, 504th is decimated by the end of that day. 505th has fought its guts out to take the approaches to the bridge that allows the 30 Corps tanks to get across there. So, basically, in my view, built-up areas, towns like this, they eat up infantry like, a moviegoer eating up popcorn. At a 3-hour movie. That's just going to suck your infantry away. The British aren't exactly drowning in infantry. You need combined arms to push on Arnhem. And the point I've made many times is, let's say in a best case scenario, 30 Corps is able to get their formations across in a cohesive enough manner to push that 11 miles. So which direction are you going to go? Are you going to Oosterbeek to relieve the bulk of the division there? Or are you going to relieve Frost? Are you really going to be able to have 2 pushes? How is that going to work? And of course, I'm sure you guys have seen that.
You can get to Frost.
Right? You're going to go to Frost, yeah, because that's the main bridge. Yeah. And what happens to the rest of the division? But you guys have seen the terrain. It's ideal for anti-tank guns, and the British understand this. And so, yeah, I don't think the 82nd Airborne could have been much help. They were willing to go, to their credit. And of course, I've criticized or I've defended the British, but I also think they ought to have at least tried. If the 82nd Airborne guys were willing to go across a major river system in boats and risk their lives that way, and one of the most epic fights in American history, I think somebody ought to have at least tried. I don't think it would have worked, but maybe that would have been better for everybody's morale and ultimate. The relations, I think, between 30 Corps and the Airborne were unfortunately not good among veterans going on in the decades. But again, it's just part of market guard. These guys are paying the price for the bad overall concept, and I think they're all doing the very best they can. And by the way, the valor of those British tankers, I don't know of any other more courageous fighters. It's just really amazing in my opinion. So I think they kind of get a bad rap in my opinion.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Joe.
We keep glancing at it. We keep hitting right off the side of it. What about the Vol River crossing? What about Julian Cook? Tell me about Robert Redford.
What's he up to?
Yeah, so what a choice to play Julian Cook. Wouldn't we all love to be played by Robert Redford in his prime, right? That's that's going to be unforgettable. But he's, I think he captures him on some levels. But Julian Cook was a little more tart. I think he was, he didn't quite have the overall, shall I say, respect or reverence of his men just yet. He was going to, very well deserved. He was a devout Catholic. Hence, this one thing that he really got right, how he says, Hail Mary, full of grace, as he's going across, he's terrified. And that's a crisis prayer for Catholic, in case those who are not familiar with Roman Catholicism. So why are they chosen for this mission? What's that, Joe?
We do that.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. So why are they chosen for the mission? Because they hadn't seen all that much action relative to the rest of the 504th at this point. So Gavin sees them as a ready formation to carry out what he views as an incredibly difficult mission, and he's right. And I think we tend to forget that Gavin lines up a pretty decent amount of fire support for them. The guards tankers, the smoke screens, the airstrikes, some level of artillery here and there, and also other infantry units that are giving fire support with their weapons. That's at least somewhat helpful. But in the end, you're talking about, 400, 500 odd guys at most in boats. We forget, by the way, that the airborne engineers are the ones really responsible for the boats and helping get them across, salvage them, and then get them back for the reinforcement. Because this is done in waves, not just one group overall. So there's a timetable with this whole thing. And I think, by the way, too, I've often said this, kudos to the British engineers who have somehow found a way to get these things to the head of this column. Yeah. When you're talking about, what was it at that point, 45, 50-mile corridor that's crowded and confused, and you're under shell fire. They lose one of the trucks, so they lose some of the boats, and I think these guys sometimes get a bad rap because the paratroopers are waiting around, and of course the more time we lose, the worse is this going to be, and I think they get a little bit of a bad rap. I think they did a pretty amazing job to even deliver the boats at all, much less in reasonable condition, which they sort of are. So what's this like going across the river? Is one of the most intense fights in American history.
How wide is the river where they cross?
This is it's almost about a mile wide. So this is a major river system. This is actually wider than the Rhine at the time. And so you're talking about canvas boats, flimsy, that have no intrinsic power of their own. So there's no motors on them, nothing like that. So they come, some of them with paddles, some not. And so it's either paddles you're using or your rifle butts or your hands. In some cases, the paratroopers use their hands. It's amazing to me. So you've got, dozen and a half guys packed aboard a boat, maybe something like that. A couple engineers who are supposed to guide this whole mess. And you're basically getting across a mile of this with I think about a 3 to 4 mile per hour current. So that's significant. And you're taking flanking fire from the railroad bridge that would be to your right if you're one of these paratroopers. So that's 20 millimeter fire and machine gun fire and rifle fire coming there. And that's what's killing a number of these guys. A couple of them who get their head blown off. There's a distressing number of headshots. And some of it is the 20 millimeter fire. Some of it is rifle fire, which that's got to be pretty accurate. And then, of course, you've got this Fort Holland Van Hoof that's right in front of you. And so that's fire too. And you've got this embankment that looks down at the river. The Germans are up on the embankment, so they're able to fire down on you. So you're sort of a fish in a barrel here. I think it's amazing that as many of them made it across as did. It's a testament to their level of physical fitness to even do this, and their resolve, and something of the fire support too. I think really does help. But you have a moment here which you don't often see in modern combat, at least for Americans, in which you have American soldiers who are going to be completely and totally unforgiving of the enemy and not willing to take prisoners. And what I mean by that, not just we're fired up or whatever. These guys are very angry because they've taken so much fire while they were vulnerable on the water. And they cannot forgive those who were shooting at them like fish in a barrel. So most of those Germans that are on the other side of the river are not like, Aryan specimens or whatever. These are teenagers, and these are overaged men begging for their lives, and the paratroopers in most cases are just simply going to mow them down with impunity. You have others who are caught on the railroad bridge between the 505th and the British armor that are fighting on that side, and then Cook's guys coming from the other side, and they're going to get completely kind of vice gripped in the middle of that. By the records that I saw, claim that 267 Germans were killed either on the bridge, or some of them are shot off the bridge or jump into the water to try and escape. It's really a bloodbath, much less that the smaller groups that are eventually going to get to the road bridge start to take it from that north side, even as the British tanks are going to come across from the other side. And this is fairly well portrayed in the movie. It has to be oversimplified, but yeah, it's a pretty dramatic fight. You can understand why Cook wants something to come out of it, some kind of result.
Sounds like we need to commission a painting, like Washington on the Delaware. John, obviously this topic of, America's perspective in Market Garden was obviously so important to you that you wrote a book titled, again, September Hope. Again, we're all about shameless plugs here, so we're really plugging that in there. What do you hope that we get from your book?
Yeah, well, I hope that it really rounds out that picture and gives you an idea of the U.S. perspective. Certainly the experience of what these guys went through, not just during the Market Garden phase of September 17th to 26th, but after too, in basically holding a perimeter, and the interactions they had with the Dutch, what that means, I think, to this day for American and Dutch relations. I really think a very strong friendship is forged there. Not that, of course, we didn't have a friendship with the Netherlands beforehand. I mean, the Netherlands are one of the reasons why America comes into being in terms of helping finance the revolutionaries in the 1770s. So, this isn't a new relationship, but I do think it's solidified in a little bit of a different way. And I think Market Garden is one of the reasons for that. I hope that maybe I convey the absolute long shot nature of this operation when it's predicated on such a kind of quicksand kind of foundation, in my opinion, which I don't know how anyone could really dispute that in a way. It's such a shoestring, and yet it's so impressive how they're able to plan it in a week, how they're able to carry it out. I mean, it really conveys the incredible professionalism we have now. But even though we have that, we have an ability to deceive ourselves too. And I think there's some good lessons to draw from that, because I think it's fair to say it's not the last time we're going to kind of lie to ourselves about major military operations or wars or whatever. So I do think it's a cautionary tale that a lot can be learned from there. And I hoped too in the book to expand the larger scope of this whole story to say, the Skelt is part of the same story. They're linked. It's like, different chapters of a same book in a sense, that they really are part of the same story. And I think that has tended to get lost in our kind of airborne fixation with Market Garden, that I think it's long overdue to kind of revise the scope of it, because I think when you see it that way, you really do see how destructive Market Garden was for Allied designs in the fall of 1944.
But was that your boohickey? Because that was a really good boohickey.
Yeah, and because usually what we like to do is like to dispel myths about anything. And as we've come to find out on this show, that the sexier something is, the more myth revolves around it. And we're doing that thing where we're attempting to make Market Garden, maybe a little bit more noticeable, because Market Garden is one of those things that people kind of forget about. They kind of go from D-Day landings and they kind of jump all the way forward to, Battle of the Bulge and forget that
the war's over.
And then the war's over. No problem. Yeah, and we clearly know that's not the case.
I noticed it this time, Bo, this time around with the anniversary of D-Day having just passed, it was almost as if, Americans and British and Canadians showed up on June 6th and they marched to Berlin and that was it. There was no talk of having to fight 90 days to get to Paris and the 99-day campaign through France. There's nothing about Belgium or Holland. Completely forget the Bulge. And it's, this was the operation that brought about the downfall of the Third Reich. Yeah, but it took like another almost year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened there between and I often hear it described D-Day described as a turning point. I just really revolt against that. No, the turning points had already happened. It's a pivot point. It's the pivot point to what will be the end of the war. And by the way, there's also if we're talking the Battle of the Bulge, there's a market garden angle to that too, because when the market garden happens, Hitler decides he has to launch his own counteroffensive. So he's thinking in terms of striking back and moving resources in that direction so much as he can throughout the fall of 44. So market garden is
which if you can lift it and you can use it.
Oh, there we go. Snow
Peter
and Steel.
God, that's heavy. Peter makes a point about that in the beginning of Snow and Steel. Just listen to that. That's illegal. Okay.
I always make the joke that Teddy Roosevelt was actually carrying snow and steel or sand and steel or fire and steel when he was giving his famous speech and he was shot, and he just kind of
that would save his life. Absolutely. And the wonderful thing about it, the book is so incredibly thick, but then yet you're like, oh my gosh, it ended too soon, because it's so beautifully written. It's so well done. Peter is just,
his books are fantastic. And then to get him to talk is a lot like reading his book. It just goes, and then when he goes, all right, well, I think I'm done. It's like, wait, no, we just got started.
No, I want to know more.
Hours ago, though.
It's so true.
But he makes that point very, very clearly in the first few pages of Snow and Steel, is that, well, with the failure of Market Garden, and I'm only putting it in quotes because it gets so contentious and people are going to say, well, okay. Anyways, he makes the point that without Market Garden, do you get a Battle of the Bulge? Do you have a Hitlerian last gasp for an offensive in the West? Probably not.
Probably not. So
and if you keep the broad front going, how can the Germans concentrate in one area and punch that massive thrust into Allied lines? So, Bo, if that was your boohickey, then I guess we have to do what's in your cup.
Yes.
So, Bo.
So, like we said earlier, this is our third episode, and of the day. So I have now officially moved on from the creameries of bourbon in my coffee to a famous ale, Yingling Lager, which is one of the oldest. It's supposedly the original amber beer made over there in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. And well, unfortunately, the only bad part is now I'm almost out. So, Joey, what you got over there?
Oh, I was going to turn it over to John.
Well, I'm very boring compared to Bo. I have water, so I'm an old man, so I have to be careful. I'm an old man.
Carbonated water. I put a thing of lemonade in there. You're in good company.
I'm just alcohol.
The Yingling's good stuff. Good.
That's right. It is. And alcoholics go to meetings. I have yet to be one.
You're in a meeting right now.
It's true, but not about Alcoholics Anonymous.
What you didn't know is that John and I are actually counselors.
Right.
We're here for an intervention, Bo.
Start stroking at my beard, into my mustache.
Yeah. But it's not about my alcohol consumption.
Well, John, this has been great, and I feel like we did that thing that happens when we get talking about something massive like this. We focused on the little bits here and there, and we're never able to get all of it. So this is Bo and I's invitation. Come back, because we're going to need more. Cool. And I think we need to do something on the shelf as like the perfect kind of follow up.
I think we need to see a debate between John and Marty. I think.
Oh, that would be fun.
Oh man, I'd be overmatched. I tell you, I can't.
I think he holds the same opinion.
Well, Bo, I almost forgot. I almost did that thing. Yeah. Well, now's the perfect time to remind everyone and remind myself that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum. Get out there, make some history of your own. And be sure to have some fun as you explore the Civil War battlefields all across the country, but particularly in those kind of the 6 trails program states. Follow along through Central Virginia battlefields or down into Middle Tennessee. I hope one day they'll get some signs down in Alabama so that I can really start Hood's Tennessee campaign down in Florence and go all the way up to Nashville and back. But, remains to be seen. We'll see what happens. But for Drew and the guys to be out there, they just finished up, 63 signs in 6 days. That's like British 30 Corps. 64 miles in 2 days. But they were 100% successful.
They really were.
Got all their signs in. So there's Civil War trails. John, anything you want to add? Naturally the book recommendation is September Hope, an American Point of View of Market Garden. Anything else out there that we've got to just pick it up?
Well, I think it's worth taking a look at Anthony Beever's book that he published. What was that, about 5-6 years ago, I think. It's called Arnhem, but it really is more than that. It's but also in terms of newer works, Al Murray's new book on Arnhem. So Joe's showing the Battle of Arnhem, which I think, as usual, it's beautifully written, like everything Anthony writes. But Al Murray has just come out with a brand new book about Arnhem. I know no one who knows more about the British paras in the Arnhem area than Al. So I think I highly recommend taking a look at what he's got to say.
Yeah, and he is he's slated for an appearance on the show. So
good.
Ryan, we just have to get the schedule to work out right. But there we go. So John, great to see you. Always a good time. Bo, a pleasure as always.
John, it was great meeting you. I'm hoping one day we can do it in person.
Yeah, absolutely, Bo. Sounds good.
And I guess let's let the end credits roll.